I'm a bit predisposed to learn about Polish poetry just because my daughter married a man who was born in Poland, and his father was jailed and was in the Lech Walesa resistance. And so I don't know anything about Poland. So every once in a while, I learn something about it.
Mm-hmm.
And Wislawa Szymborska, I had never studied her poetry, but when I was in my MFA program, one of my professors gave a whole presentation on her, and that fascinated me. So I bought a book called Spoiling Cannibals Fun, Polish Poetry of the Last 2 Decades of Communist Rule. And I love the title. And I will tell you that maybe you figured this out. Spoiling Cannibals Fun refers to the communist regime.
Mm-hmm.
So this poetry is not current poetry, and Wislawa died in 2012, but she was the most popular woman poet, according to what I've read, in Poland, and very well known, and received the Nobel Prize in 1996 for literature. She was born in 1923, and the family lived on an estate that belonged to a count where her father was a steward. But then they moved when she was 8 years old to Krakow, and she went to the equivalent of high school there. And then she studied sociology and literature at, I don't know how to pronounce it, but a university in Krakow. She published her first poem in a newspaper when she was, 1945, so she would have been 22. And the poem was called I Seek the Word. I haven't been able to find a copy of that, but I like the fact that it draws attention to looking about words. And then in 52, she published a book called, translated as That's Why We Are Alive. And that book was an attempt to somehow use the officially approved literary style of the communist regime. And I don't know exactly what that means. I didn't go into it with depth, but she was trying to, live somehow within the framework of her government. Then she did a lot of translation of French poetry, and she worked for a magazine called Literary Life. She was a reviewer and a translator and was writing poetry all along. And then she wrote for the underground press. So obviously she became more liberalized as life moves along. So she published more than a dozen volumes of poetry, and actually disowned the first volumes that she had written under the communist regime because she was disgusted with the way she had tried to conform, that it just wasn't indicative of her true poetic intentions. And then she did a book called Calling Out to Yeti, and I haven't gotten a hold of that, but that's a more personal approach to poetry. So one reason why she is liked is because her poetry is, people have thought her poetry is fairly accessible, and yet it has some deeply resonant, thoughts to dig into. So I haven't minded for all that I would like to, but I'm really interested with what you might have to say about the poems that she's written. These are all in translation, of course, and there are two main, from the research I did, two main translators of Polish poetry into English, and they are the ones that did this collection. So there are just lots of Polish poets that were important in their time. And I'm not very broad in my study of poetry in other worlds, so that's why I chose Wislawa.
Linda, or anyone who may know the answer to this is a question somewhat about names and how they're rendered into English. And I'm sorry, but I don't know if the Polish alphabet, I would assume it borrows from the Russian alphabet. So I don't know if it's a question of transliteration, but the ways in her last name, which I take it is pronounced Szymborska, the number of letters that you often get in Slavic names that are either not pronounced or seem extra by our standards or our practice. Did you come across any information about how that gets translated or transliterated?
No, but I could do a little more study because there is a good introduction in the book. I don't remember anything that I read about that, so I'd have to reacquaint myself. Don't know.
Okay.
A valid question for sure. So we could start with On Death Without Exaggeration. Does that meet with your interest? Do you all have copies?
Yep.
I'd be happy to read it unless someone else feels called to read it.
Please do.
Go for it.
On Death Without Exaggeration. It can't take a joke, find a star, make a bridge. It knows nothing about weaving, mining, farming, building ships, or baking cakes. In our planning for tomorrow, it has the final word, which is always beside the point. It can't even get the things done that are part of its trade: dig a grave, make a coffin, clean up after itself. Preoccupied with killing, it does the job awkwardly, without system or skill, as though each of us were its first kill. Oh, it has its triumphs, but look at the countless defeats, missed blows, and repeat attempts. Sometimes it isn't strong enough to swat a fly from the air. Many's the caterpillar that has outcrawled it. All those bulbs, pods, tentacles, fins, trachea, nuptial plumage, and winter fur snow show that it's fallen behind with its half-hearted work. Ill will won't help, and even our lending a hand with wars and coup d'etat is so far not enough. Hearts beat inside eggs. Baby skeletons grow. Seeds hard at work sprout their first tiny pair of leaves, and sometimes even tall trees fall away. Whoever claims that it's omnipotent is himself living proof that it's not. There's no life that couldn't be immortal, if only for a moment. Death always arrives at that very moment too late. In vain, it tugs at the knob of the invisible door. As far as you've come, can't be undone. That makes me wish I had found out more about her own death.
Is death a metaphor for communism?
Well, I think it could be, considering when this poem was written. That did cross my mind. And find a star, for example, might be an indicator of relationship to communism. What do others of you think?
I really like, this is the obvious thing about the poem, but the way she manages to explore the paradoxes of ongoing life leading to death, but the fulfillment in life that doesn't get stolen, etc. I mean, just wonderful. Whoever claims that it's omnipotent is himself living proof that it's not. the succinctness of that statement. A whole series of kind of bold challenges to this thing that humans fear.
What do you find positivism in the stanza immediately following? There's no life that couldn't be immortal if only for a moment. How could we deconstruct and interpret that?
Thank you for asking, because that was the piece I was curious about. I don't have an answer. I just have curiosity.
Well, I bet someone in the group does.
To me, it's reminiscent of Blake's Eternity in an Hour. So,
Hmm.
mine.
Yeah. I think it's layered with paradox and irony, but I hear hope in it. I hear something very, very positive.
I found it a hopeful poem, and just in its causing me to think about death in a little different light.
Well, it dismisses death throughout the poem, but not in any light or mindless way. It's so thoughtful an exploration. I mean, it really gets at the richness of living.
Without saying it. It's great.
Well, and I think the verse that Linda raised, there's no life that couldn't be immortal. To me, that's pay attention. Pay attention, particularly since we are the skilled craftspeople. Death can't do anything, can't even clean up after itself, and it doesn't always do a good job. We know how to tell a joke and find a star and make a bridge and weave and mine and farm and bake a cake. We are much more skilled than death.
I have a question about maybe it's translation, but the grammar. I really, and Amory, I'm reading the poem as you just stated it, but in that paragraph, whoever claims that it's omnipotent is, why not say is living proof that it's not? Why the himself? And then in the next paragraph, there's no life that couldn't be immortal, if only for a moment, is saying it, as I read it, all lives are immortal, if only for moments, because we are bringing things into life by being alive. So why was it so said as a negative? No life that couldn't be, a double negative.
Does she write? I have a question, Linda. Did she write in English or did she write in?
She wrote in Polish.
Because this is an amazing translation. I mean, it feels like it was originally written in English, and we're talking a lot about this common. I don't want to say slang, but this kind of common, everyday style of talking that she's using. It helped me to identify immediately with this poem.
I think a translator would love to know that it felt like it was originally written in English, and so would Wislawa.
Yeah,
to know that her ideas have universality and are rewritten, as it were, in a language that we can resonate with.
Mm.
You know, my older brother led a team that repaired Bethlehem's open hearts throughout the country, and he died in 1999 of terrible complications from lung issues and so on. And when he finally died, his last word was, he said to his wife, "Am I dying?" And she said, "Yes, you are." And he said, "I'm ready." And because he was in so much pain, and this poem makes me realize that he wasn't just giving up, he was making a decision.
Mhm.
Oh, wow.
That's
Wow.
that's a powerful example, really, and one that we might to employ ourselves.
Yeah.
Well, Ron's brother, Ron's older brother made a choice, so maybe I should too, even though I didn't know him.
Yes.
Thank you.
I've heard so many stories where folks are traveling, racing to get to the bedside of a parent or their favorite uncle or something, and they're racing across the nation to get to that bedside on planes and trains, and the people they wait until they can say goodbye to that one relative or loved one. I've heard so many stories like that. It's interesting.
I think of John Donne's poem, Death Be Not Proud, which is a sonnet and which is very ingenious. It's a good example of a metaphysical poem. But this poem just explores so many dimensions of this contradiction, this paradox that she raises.
I find it hopeful, or at least consoling, the acknowledgement that death's got the last word. And we haven't figured that out. Death has the last word. But we have all of the rest to build and create and do, and in our control. And that's really quite so that's what we're called to steward, is that time that we have.
I think that's true. However, in this paragraph, she says, ill will won't help, and even our lending a hand with wars and coup d'etat is so far not enough. And I think we've come to the place in time where we have to recognize the power of our myths, the power of our stories, and that life needs our help. And as far as you've come can't be undone. We have to relook at that. And now's the time. Because I don't think she upholds the Polish experience of the coup d'etat, even though she lived through it.
Yeah.
Right?
What was you don't think she upholds it? Is that what you said?
I don't think I think if she'd had a choice, she would have preferred not to have her country overrun.
Yes.
And if she had a choice, she would prefer not to have pandemics. And if she had a choice, so I just think it's important to think about whatever the question I asked earlier in those two stanzas. What is she saying there? Whoever claims that it's omnipotent is himself living proof that it's not. There's no life that couldn't be immortal if only for a moment. I really am curious. What are we thinking is going on there?
I'll start out with the title of the poem being On Death. So I read it from the perspective that this is about death and how we think about death and how it can claim a lot of our living when we're thinking too much about death. So I think for me, I read it as we need to think less about death and more about living. So to answer your question, whoever claims that it's omnipotent is himself living proof that it's not. It's to the people who are continue to push death, the fear of death, and the worry of that to drive us to do something that we wouldn't choose to do if we were thinking about how we should be living. And that's the second stanza. There's no life that couldn't be immortal if only for a moment. So if we're thinking in terms less of death and more of living, then these two stanzas make sense to me.
I love the idea of a caterpillar that has outcrawled death.
Yeah.
For me, I feel the sense of timing. and that the timing is actually perfect, and yet it's not. She talks about it as it does the job awkwardly. I love it. She's really, to me, she's really painting the character of death in such an interesting way. And I absolutely, there's so many lines that I just love. Oh, it has its triumphs, but look at the countless defeats, miss blows, and repeat attempts. I just love that because it doesn't, when someone just almost dies, what was that? Was that death kind of going, I almost got him,
Well, don't many of the lines seem to be playful?
Yes.
Yes, they do.
But look, the line that gets me, that kind of sends a little chill under to me, it is in my bones, is as far as you've come can't be undone. And the truth is, people die all the time, like on the operating table, or they're revived from death, from an accident, on the street. And so people die all the time, and they're even placed into comas and all kinds of things medically. And I think about that power that we have. I mean, unless you have a do not resuscitate bracelet on, they're going to try to resuscitate you. And I just, yeah. I don't know. That's a real, that's so personal. That's a real personal choice. But does that mean death is being undone? Or does that mean that, it didn't get us? Was that supposed to happen? You know what I mean? That right there is got me.
To me, the whole thing is that death is irrelevant. Each of we might have ill will, and we might have coups, and we might have wars and everything else, but life still goes on. And, each day you have, there's a heart beating, and babies are growing, and seeds are sprouting. Every day, death is irrelevant.
If you folks will forgive me quoting myself, when my son died in 2010, the first couple of lines of my eulogy on him said, "Throughout the years, the poets have reminded us that we measure the value of a life not by its length, but by its depth. And that John died young, but he wasn't cheated." And this gives me so much more conviction, this poem, about those thoughts. So thank you.
Yeah. I think this is a poem we could continue to ponder, and I wonder if we should move on to either Stage Fright or In Broad Daylight.
Yes.
What is your pleasure?
You choose, Linda.
You choose.
I would just like to say that the idea of an invisible door and the idea of being immortal can come at any time in synchronistic moments when we're brought back through memory, love, opportunities to return to people we have known just by paying attention at a certain moment. Yeah.
Thank you, Betty. As I said, there's a lot we could continue to talk about this. I would really like us to do In Broad Daylight, but I think it's longer than 10 minutes because In Broad Daylight is about a political person who died. But let's do Stage Fright. I think that'll resonate with us
well, if I can say, ask, we have 2 poems today, is that right, to look at?
Yes.
We could give the next poem a good 20 minutes, 10 minutes here, and then after break, maybe, perhaps.
Okay, well, let's see how this, this is kind of navel gazing and I really like it. So stage fright.
Okay, stage fright you chose. Okay.
Poets and writers, so the saying goes, that is, poets are writers, but poets are poetry, writers are prose. Prose can hold anything, including poetry, but in poetry, there's only room for poetry. In keeping with the poster that announces it with a, how do you say that, fin de siècle, flourish of its giant P, framed in a winged lyre's strings, I should simply walk in, I should fly. And wouldn't I be better off barefoot to escape the clunk and squeak of cut-rate sneakers at clumsy ersatz angel? If at least the dress were longer and more flowing and the poems appeared not from a handbag, but by sleight of hand, dressed in their Sunday best from head to toe, with bells on ding to dong, A, B, B, A. On the platform lurks a little table suggesting seances with gilded legs, and on the little table smokes a little candlestick, which means I've got to read by candlelight. What I wrote by the light of an ordinary bulb to the typewriter's tap, 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 without worrying in advance if it was poetry, and if so, what kind? The kind in which poem is inappropriate, or the kind which is apropos in prose. And what's the difference, seen now only in half light, against a crimson curtain's purple fringe? That's very whimsical in contrast to what we just read. Does that make sense to you?
It reminds me of your writing. It reminds me of the way that you play with words, and yeah.
I think she's having fun with the way that she throws in cut rate sneakers and an ersatz angel and a little table with gilded legs. I'm not sure what all that means, but it's whimsical.
Many of her passages are prosy, and but not what we'd call prosaic. So I think she's really, there's so much teasing in the poem, even of her own enterprise, and teasing in a couple of ways, just eking out the shades of difference, but kind of diminishing the stark difference that we insist on between poetry and prose.
Yeah. Do you think she does that deftly, the way she compares poetry and prose, or does it add more confusion to your understanding?
It makes it more ambiguous.
So is she also, from the title Stage Fright, talking about the poet that is used as the intro to the bigger event, the prose writer? Poets,
I hadn't thought of that.
Oh, that's what I thought was happening. Poets are poetry. And what suggested that to me was on the second page, on the platform lurks a little table. And I thought that was on a stage where she was performing. That's how I put it together, that she was perhaps performing as the opening act. The kind in which prose is inappropriate, or the kind which is apropos in prose. That's how I put those things together.
I'm almost right there with you, Betty, except I was thinking that the table that was set up like a seance table, that maybe a writer is channeling a poet, and a poet is sometimes channeling a writer.
Oh.
How are you defining writer?
Well, based on what she says up here, the same lines that Betty just talked about. Poets are poetry and writers are prose. So that a writer, a writer, it's difficult for a writer who writes long formats to condense themselves into the structure of poetry and vice versa.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. And the idea of stage fright is carried to the very end against a crimson curtains, purple fringe. You actually get the vision of performance, a performance poet.
Well, the color purple. Well, go ahead.
He was famous in doing performances.
Lynn, unfortunately, you kept cutting out. Say it again, please.
Do we know when this poem was written? Was she already famous and doing performances?
No, this was beforehand.
Oh.
So maybe that's, I mean, maybe she was doing it in coffee houses or something like that, but it was before she was famous.
When I see crimson and purple, I think about passion and bruising. That there's,
oh, geez.
Yeah, there's an effort and, correction, perhaps. But that's me. That's.
Well, a little table.
Color symbolism. Pardon
if
me?
she was reading in a coffee house, the little table would make sense, and half light, the darkness of the coffee house.
Mm-mm.
And she's got to read by candlelight what she wrote by the light of an ordinary bulb. So it's the writing is one effort, the performing is another. And in that, she is saying there's some stage fright and things that she maybe does not anticipate when she's sitting at the typewriter, tapping, without worrying in advance if it's poetry. And her poem is very prose-like, just cut into.
It is, you're right.
Is it poetry? And if so, what kind? But then honestly, why does it matter, right? I don't know. I look at it today and I see a lot of modern poetry is mixed.
Well, that's true. And I think that's upsetting to people with a more classic understanding of what poetry is. I keep thinking about stage fright, that it's scary for a poet. It might be scary for a poet to move on to the stage of prose writing, and more scary for a prose writer to move into the stage of poetry writing. So who would like to read In Broad Daylight?
Shannon was going to.
Shannon, will you?
Sure. I'm putting lotion on. I need to be lotioned up for this.
If you say so.
All right. In broad daylight. He would vacation in a mountain boarding house. He would come down for lunch from his table by the window. He would scan the 4 spruces branch to branch without shaking off the freshly fallen snow. Goateed and balding, gray-haired and glasses, with coarse, weathery, weary features. With a wart on his cheek and a furrowed forehead, as if clay had covered up the angelic marble, he would know himself when it all happened. The price, after all, was not having died already. Goes up in leaps. Goes up not in leaps, but step by step, and he would pay that price too. About his ear, just grazed by the bullet, when he ducked at the last minute, he would say, I was damn lucky. While waiting to be served his noodle soup, he would read a paper with the current date, giant headlines, and tiny prints of ads, or drum his fingers on the white tablecloth with his hands, and his hands would have been used a long time now, with their chapped skin and swollen veins. Sometimes someone would yell from the doorway, "Mr. Bonanza, phone call for you." And there'd be nothing strange about that. Being him, about him, standing up, straightening his sweater, and slowly moving towards the door. At this sight, no one would stop talking. No one would freeze in mid-gesture, mid-breath, because this commonplace event would be treated, such a pity, as a commonplace event.
This poem to me is sort of indicative of the other two poems also, in the sense that she uses the commonplace to be extraordinary.
And a very ordinary appearing man with his aging clothes. And
I don't know how true to life this poem is, because Mr. Baksinsky has been referred to as a bard of the last generation, who was a real poet. And
that changes everything.
Is anchored in his life, I don't know, but he was a contemporary of Wislawa's. He was born in 1921, a couple years before, and his father was a literary critic, and his mother was a teacher, and they were Jewish roots. He wrote poetry early on, and he actually wanted to be an artist, but he couldn't be an artist because his father died and they didn't have any money left and all that sort of thing. But he was very left wing. He was shot down, and I'm not sure where that was. I think it was during the Warsaw Uprising, and I didn't look that up to see when that was. But he was killed in action by a German sniper.
Is she imagining that he's still alive and just having soup in a cafe years later?
Well, but you see, most of these poems were written in the 40s and 50s, and some in the 60s. So I don't know when this particular one was written, so that would helpful. So I don't know if she's imagining this or what. I just know that it's based on a real person.
How old was the man? Say again how old he would have been when he died?
In his 30s.
23.
In a way that answers the
23, you're right.
The query that I had of why a poet would use so many woods. There are 12 woods in a fairly short poem.
Maybe it was bad translation.
No, actually, this is what would have been if he
had survived.
This is the conditional.
That's what she's telling us with all those woods, with that information.
Oh, that's brilliant.
I think so. And
yeah,
Linda, thank you for telling. I hadn't looked it up. Thank you for telling us who he was.
Yeah, we needed that.
And then, Lynn, you're mentioning, I think she's picturing, how I understand it now, this might have been his fate if he hadn't lost his life to the cause. He would be an elderly man, and no one would recognize, more the pity. I was going to ask what more the pity meant, or such a pity. No one would recognize what a hero is in their midst. And I think how often that's true, to be somewhere and all of a sudden we'll say, did you realize that was, then they name someone who had just been seated quietly somewhere. And no, I didn't. Whoa, I did not know that. And now a hero was seated there. Yeah.
I love this poem. I like all of her poetry, but this one
do too.
this particularly I like.
I was really taken by this poem, especially when I read about Baksinsky, because even though he died really young, he had a fascinating life. He got married, and his wife became his inspiration and his muse for writing erotic poetry, I read.
Oh, spicy.
Yeah, so I haven't read any of his erotic poetry, but he had this wife, and I don't know if he had children, but in order to support his family, he did all kinds of odd jobs, like painting banners and shoveling coal and doing telephone orders for a sanitation country. And then he was in the army, and he was participated in sabotage actions against the people who were occupying, and weapons were hid in his apartment for patriotic, use. So
In the printing that you have is in the second stanza, does it end with pay that price too, and then there's another stanza, or does that stanza go on about his ear? I'm curious about no stanza break there.
Yeah, there should be a stanza break there.
Okay.
I didn't put it in, though.
Okay, that's all right. That's all I needed to know.
Does that change everything for you, Lynn?
Well, I think it makes a difference in what she's if the ear is somehow connected to the price that he's paid.
I should look that up. That's what my memory is, but I could be wrong. It's not. I didn't get it out of the Polish poetry book.
Does anyone else feel that there's a love with this man? There's a connection. There's an admiration.
Yes, definitely. I think it's her paean, her tribute, her appreciation for this man who whom she felt was an important poet, and others felt she was an important poet, and a man. I don't know. I wonder if she knew him in their various underground activities in the 40s.
Oh my gosh.
It's a very personal poem, the imagining that she does, and I'm glad to feel that it is conditional. He would.
I'm also really excited that poets hanging out in cafes is something's been going on for the ages.
Yeah.
I'm proud to be a part of that.
The poem doesn't explicitly say this, but I think there's a strong suggestion that we know his worth because he died in the way that he did. And had he lived, we'd have just treated him as ordinary. I mean, that is the conditional that Lynn was pointing out. But it's an interesting recognition about wonderful capturing of the details of what his life would have been and his demeanor, all concealed his real worth.
Mm-hmm.
Can't you imagine that Wislawa sitting there imagining and thinking about him, and then distilling it all into the words that she wanted? I think this must have been a rich experience for her personally. If we all think about when we envision poems and how all of our background factors into it, I'd love to know more about if they had a relationship. I might have to do more research. I might have to get a PhD.
Don't do that.
I don't have time.
Nah, another master's degree. I really like this, but I can't decide. The more I read it, the more sad it makes me.
Hmm.
I've read, this is a very familiar setting. I think of it particularly in all the British writers that I've read, the elderly living by themselves in a boarding house, coming together for the meal that's served and leaving quietly, not recognized. Now he died a hero. If he had lived, her picture doesn't diminish what he had done, but he's living now in obscurity.
Yeah, but in fact, he was recognized. And she must have, I don't know if she knew that, but he's called the Bard of the Lost Generation.
But
And
not in this poem, he's not. He's not recognized.
Well, she could just be commenting on the people around him. At this site, no one would stop talking. No one would freeze in mid-gesture. I don't know. I still feel there's some hope in it. She's thinking some people would do this, be treated such a pity as a commonplace event. I'm just trying to extract hope from it, but I think you're probably right, Amory. Darn it.
He's gray-haired, he's balding, he's coarsened.
He's wary.
But
He's
outside
Got
having
a damn wart.
I
He
think
doesn't talk to others. He reads the paper. No one recognizes. And that's such a pity. I think the reason I read some sadness there, be treated such a pity as a commonplace event, as opposed to the hero walks among us.
I read that such a pity.
What do you think of the lament, which is really what this is with a title that in broad daylight?
I think.
That's interesting.
Well, I think that's damning of us. These special people are among us. They're in broad daylight. They're not hidden. We just don't know them.
I think this is a wonderful poem by a writer who thinks a lot about immortality, about death, about making a name, or supporting others to be respected, named, heard, appreciated. That's what I'm getting from these three combined.
I agree.
And it is talking, for me, about how we treat elders.
Yeats has a poem in memory of Major Robert Gregory. It's a poem about the same young man who was the subject of an Irish airman foresees his own death. Major Gregory is the son of his patron, Lady Gregory, and he died. He was shot down his airplane in World War I. And in the poem, in memory of Major Robert Gregory, a wonderful elegy, the voice in the poem says, "How could we dream that he could comb gray hair?"
Mm-hmm.
That, I mean, I don't need to explain it. There's a tragedy in that he died, but a lot of it is our tragedy. In both those poems, Yeats says he died a magnificent death. But I've always loved that line. How could we dream that he could comb gray hair? It's us.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Well, I think that in broad daylight, with knowing what you've told us already, to me, she's just, it's a lament against war and losing a generation and losing all these lives through that process. And when she says it's a pity at the bottom, I read that as it's a pity that he was, or such a pity that we didn't get to enjoy someone who was so talented. We did have a short time with him. And maybe his stuff would have become less relevant, but he might have been a superstar his whole life. We won't know.
I don't know what all of you thought about the coverage of Prince Philip's death, but I thought there was a lot of tension in trying to capture his importance. This person whose life was a consort, and I hope this is not unfair. I could not help but be saddened by the continuing reference to His Royal Highness. The idea that there are people addressed these days in our world as His Royal Highness, and it's sad that he died. But on the other hand, it's almost it's so ironic that somebody could be called that. In my view.
Yeah.
I missed. Are you talking about Philip?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's archaic, but why?
Well, if somebody called me Your Royal Highness, I would have said, don't call me that. I had enough problems with my students calling me Dr. Ron. I said, leave off the doctor and call me Ron. And I mean, that was my choice, but I didn't want.
But why? I'm not getting your point. Why are you surprised that the royal family has hung on to that language? That's
because because it's such a sign of their being archaic.
It's dehumanizing.
Yeah.
The time for the royal family is past, in my view. I mean,
it is, and that's why I
$1
think
trillion
you're on to the
being spent
trappings.
there.
Linda,
Thank you
so
for
much.
these, though. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, thanks,
Yes,
Linda.
thank you so much, Linda.
I was saying to Emery in the break, whatever you bring up, this group has interesting thoughts on whatever poet we choose. And you're just such a rich resource. Every one of you.
Good stuff.
Even His Royal Highness, the Dr. Ron.
Only for a moment.
Is everyone-
Thank you.
Yeah.